Welcome back. My name is Jim Kaseman. We're talking about how to get to know God intimately. And of course, in order to do that, we're going to have to examine the scriptures, because in the Bible is how God reveals himself, his way, how he thinks, why he does what he does. It's all revealed in the scriptures. This is the primary way that we get to know God. Now, we're going to walk in holiness with God and intimately with him. Then we have to get to know him. And this is the primary way. So then, we have to examine the entire scriptures to see how he feels. So you can talk about faith and love and healing and deliverance. But if you ignore subjects like alcohol, now you're in trouble, because you have to know what to do in every subject, not just those subjects that you feel comfortable with. I'm not going to talk about alcohol because I drink wine, and I think that's okay because everybody's doing it, even the pastor's drinking wine. So let's not talk about alcohol. Well, you can't do that. You have to examine all the topics in Scripture, all the subjects, and we've done a number of them through this past year. But now we're talking about alcohol and how it affects us as how it affects people in the Old Testament, because we're talking about the good and bad in the Old and the good and bad about alcohol in the New. So we're still working on the Old, and we find out that it's pretty similar to what's going on today. So we left off in the last session that the Old and New Testament, that wine was a symbol of God's judgment and wrath. And we looked at the scriptures for that. So in summary, the Old Testament specific tragedies resulting from the use of alcohol. It singles out special people and groups whose lives were to be examples to others, and they are commanded not to drink intoxicating beverages. Clear Old Testament commands declare that we are not to look upon fermented wine with longing or desire. Intoxicating wine mocks and impoverishes. It contributes to immorality and dishonesty. It warps character, encouraging selfishness and greed. It is seen as a symbol of God's wrath and judgment. Wow. All right. Wine, then, in the Old Testament, is also spoken of as a blessing, a symbol of prosperity, a source of cheer and gladness. Well, that seems to be a contradiction to everything that we've been talking about. However, to understand what the scriptures are saying, we have to look at some Hebrew words in order to clear up any confusion. And this is where it's so important for us as believers in 2 Timothy and chapter 2 and verse 15. Be diligent to present yourself approved to God, a worker who does not need to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth. So we need to study the scriptures so that we can rightly divide. Now, if you can rightly divide scriptures, you can wrongly divide them. So let's make sure that you and I rightly divide them, because rightly dividing the scripture leads to life. Wrongly dividing the scriptures leads to death. So let's do it right. All right, first of all, the Hebrew language, in general, there are two Hebrew words translated wine in the Old Testament and one Hebrew wine translated strong drink in general. So there's different words that talk about alcoholic beverages, but generally two that are used commonly, and one for strong drink and two for wine. Now, the most common is Yawin, Y-A-Y-N, Yawin. I don't know if that's pronounced right or not, but it's spelled Y-A-Y-I-N. And I've made a note here to check it out with Neum. There we go. And anyway, we'll pass that one up for right now, I guess. Oh, come on. I'd hate to give up. Okay, here we are. And we look at Nehemiah, chapter 5 and verse 18. And Now, that which was prepared daily was 1 ox and 6 chosen sheep, and also fowl were prepared, chicken in other words, fowls were prepared for me, and once every 10 days an abundance of all kinds of wine. Yet in spite of this, I did not demand the governor's provisions, because the bondage was heavy on this people. And so there were all kinds of wine. And so that word Y-A-Y-N is used for that. Now that's a generic term used about 14 times in the Old Testament, and it's most frequently applied to fermented grape juice, which is probably about 12 to 14% alcohol. By New Testament times, rabbis insisted and instructed that the wine should be diluted with water for Passover. Now, Moses' law, however, did not call for wine at Passover. And you can see that in Exodus 12, verse 8 through 11. In Old Testament times, wine was diluted. Before New Testament, no. In Old Testament times, wine was not diluted. Before New Testament times, the Hellenistic practice of mixing it with water was common. Many made it a practice to dilute wine with about 3 parts of water. On the other hand, Yahweh, Y-A-Y-I-N, can sometimes refer to fresh grape juice. Isaiah prophesying Moab's destruction says, the treader shall tread out no wine, Y-A-Y-I-N, in their presses. And in their presses. Jeremiah similarly states, I have caused wine, Yahweh, to fall from the wine presses. Fail from the wine presses. None shall tread with shouting. Jeremiah 40:33. Jeremiah even refers to the juice still in the grape as wine. See Jeremiah 40:10-12. So we've got this one word in the Hebrew, Y-A-Y-I-N, that can refer to intoxicated or not intoxicated drink. So this is where you have to look at the context of the scripture. Now, fresh juice, grape juice, pressed from the grapes, obviously is unfermented, and that's called sweet wine. Freshly squeezed from the grape cluster would be a sweet wine, and has not time to ferment. Now the Hebrew word for wine, Y-A-Y-N, can be used for fermented or unfermented wine. And of course, now we can look at some examples of it. Priests were forbidden to use fermented wine, so here the Yahweh had to be unfermented wine. And so you have to look at the context of the scriptures then, if it's going to be used for either way, fermented or unfermented. And so in Genesis 14 and in verse 18, then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. Now here, this is the word Y-A-Y-I-N, Y-N. And of course, you can see here, it had to be unfermented because he's a priest and he could not use alcohol. So it had to be an unfermented, it had to be freshly squeezed sweet wine. And it was used of the priest of God Most High. So you could not bring an alcoholic drink into that would be unholy. And you can't, as a high priest, he could not bring that in to the presence of God in his duties. So priests were forbidden, as we already saw in the scriptures, forbidden to use fermented drink. So there you take the context of that in that scripture. All right, we'll look at some others as we come back. But this is the end of this session. God bless you. You just be blessed in everything you set your hands to do. Praise the Lord.